past Sunday afternoon, Sister Nell buried her son. His name was Curtis DeWitt Moore. And then at 6:30 Sunday evening, her brother, also named Curtis, passed away. Curtis, of course, was the namesake of his uncle. And could say it was a curious thing, but it's really more a tragic thing on behalf of our sister who's having to deal with such. She's presently with her family, and I believe it's in Calhoun. I believe is where the memorial service is being conducted. And so the family, no doubt, is there with her at the present time, and certainly want to remember her in our prayers. Just got word that Stan McGuire was able to go home. He's on his way home now from the hospital. They were able to do the test and apparently were successful in what they were trying to do with this new medication. So we're happy that things worked out for him. Our study is in 1 Corinthians, by the way, and we'll try to finish 1 Corinthians and move into 2 Corinthians before this evening is over with. This is the last Wednesday of this month. Believe it or not, October is almost over. And I'm being honest with you, I just barely even thought October even started, and here it is. It's about ready to be over. And so we'll begin November, and if the elders have already decided, I believe we discussed it. I don't know if we ever firmly decided, but Brother Weaver, had wanted to begin a new practice on Wednesday evenings, the first of the month. And so if that all works out, and we'll have a chance to talk with him perhaps when he's back, we'll be having more of a prayer service next Wednesday evening. And we'll see how that goes. We'll try to organize that and have that ready for you, and certainly be able to offer up prayers and petitions in a very powerful way beginning next Wednesday evening. Also, don't forget, this coming Lord's Day is the first Sunday of the month, and we will be observing our different time: 10 o'clock Bible study, 11 o'clock worship. We'll have a fellowship meal together Sunday for the Savior, and then a 1:30 service in the afternoon. So I want to remind you about that. By the way, it's on our sign. Have you noticed that really cool sign we have in the front of our facility here? And thank you, Brother Tom, for that sign. And thank you, Brother and Sister Pettingill. I know it's a team effort to change that sign. Someone has to be out there to look at it while someone's downstairs programming it. And so far, so good. And we really, really appreciate the good work that's being put forth in this area. Last week we noted that the books of the New Testament are what we might call occasional letters. In other words, there were occasions that prompted their writing. And we were noting some of those things, those contributing factors to Paul's first, and we'll hopefully get to his second Corinthian letter this evening. One of the things that we noted last week was that there was a report that came to Paul from the house of, do you remember? Okay. And also we noted perhaps one other source of information, and that would have been some popular preacher that had been there that had left and could not be persuaded at the present time to go back. No, that would be Apollos. And perhaps there was in his mind already a great concern about not going back, because there was already a party, a clique, if you will, gathering around him. He was a great orator, a great preacher, the kind of preaching that probably most people enjoy listening to, no doubt a persuasive speaker. And so people were rallying to him for no other reason, perhaps than his oratory skills. Those were highly favored in Grecian culture. And so certainly Apollos had a leg up in that regard. And so a following was there. And so Paul was addressing the concerns that were brought to his attention by those sources But also, the Corinthians themselves had written a letter to Paul with questions. And some of those questions are dealt with beginning in chapter 7. We're not going to read chapter 7. We're not going to get into chapter 7. And the reason we don't have time to get into a lengthy discussion about what Paul is saying regarding marriage, divorce, and remarriage. I will simply summarize by saying this. He said nothing that would differ from what Jesus taught on the subject. And for someone to suggest otherwise, it's just really not being true either to the text or to the spirit of hermeneutics as we understand it. And so certainly we would, if we have the time, and perhaps we will come back and revisit that later. I do want to look at some of the chapters in 1 Corinthians tonight because I want to deal with some of those issues. But Paul dealt with a variety of them. And one of the things we noted last week, we ended on this note, Paul, of the many things he could have dealt with, the moral questions, the squabbles among brethren, he dealt with it extensively, by the way, in chapter 6, where, in a church, sometimes you'll have differences. Maybe there will be unresolved issues. And Paul was very clear in saying you should never air that dirty laundry before an unbelieving world. But if need be, you should suffer the loss of whatever it is rather than air those things. Again, in chapter 7, he talks about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Chapters 8 through 10 we'll reserve because we'll be studying those chapters tonight. And then, of course, chapter 11, there's questions about acceptable worship. Chapters 12 through 14, there's a question about spiritual gifts, how they're to be exercised in the church service. And there's a lot of very significant principles outlined about worship in those chapters that are timeless. We do know from chapter 13, for example, that the question about miracles occurring in the worship service was of a temporary nature. In fact, you're not saying much of the entire chapter of 13 was to make that very point, that the discussion about spiritual gifts was something that was temporary, was not intended by God to last. Chapter 15, there's a serious question about the resurrection and some of the views that were being espoused among Greeks in particular, that there is no resurrection or that it's already passed. And so Paul dealt with that extensively. But again, it's worth noting that of all those very large issues that were dealt with extensively by Paul, the number one issue out of the starting gate was division. And it's troubling to me that we live in a time when churches are ripped asunder because of division. And by the way, kind of digressing here, I know I shared with you several weeks ago an exchange I had with one of the sergeants where I work, who is a member of a denominational church, and he left that denominational church over a church squabble. It had to do with the preacher and the way he was spending the church money, and the deacons fired him, and the church wasn't happy about it. He was one of those that wasn't happy about it initially. He left, and he's now returned, as many have returned to that church, and told me that today. Of course, it did allow us the opportunity to discuss a little more some of the issues that have been brought up between us. So hopefully that line of discussion is still open and available to me. But he was confirming with me today, there's nothing more distressing than a church squabble. It's like, family problems. But it seemed like when it had to do in the church, there's an added dimension to it that makes it especially troubling and unsettling. And I agreed with him in that regard, but I would take it a step further and talk about religious division as a whole that is truly a detriment to the spread of New Testament Christianity in the world, and how so many have just accepted and acquiesced to the idea that we are hopelessly divided. We might as well accept it and embrace it and just go along and live and let live. I will never accept that proposition. I don't care how many believe or don't believe or scream and holler and pitch a fit or call me In fact, I've been called water dog by some of my own inmates, which is interesting to me. You call me what you want to call me, but I do believe that there's only one way to advance the gospel of Christ, and that is through the unity of those who would be followers of Jesus. So Paul dealt with that. Amen. First and foremost. But now, we're not going to have time to deal with all those issues, and that's not really what we're attempting to do in this class. But there is something I would like to do. I would like to take one of the subjects that Paul deals with and take a few moments and share them with you tonight, beginning in chapter 8. And I want to do this kind of not just to make the subject itself, which I believe is worthy of our time and consideration, but also to illustrate the nature of hermeneutics. When I say hermeneutics, what do I mean by that? How do you study the Bible? How do you read a text? And most people, when they read a text, they read a text. They read a verse. And they'll say, well, this is what was taught by Paul to the church at Corinth. Sometimes, perhaps it's true. Sometimes it's within the spirit of that context. The best way to get the context is to have the overall context. And, of course, there is the immediate context and the overall context. The immediate context is 1 Corinthians. The overall context is the New Testament. And so we understand that. But I want to break it down to chapters 8, 9, and 10. It's a unit. And sometimes we read portions of this unit and we say they're completely disconnected. But he's really saying just two basic things. In these 3 chapters, he's saying 2 basic things. And I'm not going to tell you what they are. I just want to read these chapters. And I want you to tell me, when we're finished reading these 2 chapters, what 2 primary points is he attempting to make. So, as we read these together, I want to just read the text, and I want you to hear it out loud, and I want you to react to it. And if you have something you'd like to say or a question you'd like to ask, then please feel free to do that. But it begins the subject this way: concerning things offered to idols. We know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. If anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. Therefore, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world. There is no other God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we live. However, there is not in everyone that knowledge. Now, I'm going to digress, just say this point. When he says there is not in everyone, he means there's not in every Christian one that knowledge. Every member of the church doesn't know that. Now, that may seem alarming to you. But Paul just said to us there's one God. But he's acknowledging that at Corinth, in the church, not everyone knows that. And he may even be contemplating people outside the church. But clearly there are those who are in the church who did not know that as they should. For some with consciousness of the idol, until now, eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. But food does not commend us to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, nor if we do not eat are we the worse. But beware lest somehow this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died? But when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat again, lest I make my brother stumble. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I'm not an apostle, brother, to you, at least to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who examine me is this. Do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and the first pope of the Roman Catholic Church? By the way, I'm being facetious. It's absurd for someone to suggest that popes can't marry. By the way, Peter was not the pope of the universal church. Such did not exist in the first century world, was not contemplated in the New Testament, and is an offense to someone who's being honest to the New Testament. Peter was married and he cared about his wife. And so for someone to be celibate today in the name of following the footsteps of Peter hasn't apparently read this text, because it just says that Peter, I'm sorry, but I had to say that. By the way, there is presently an effort on the part of Pope Francis, I believe is his name, to do away with celibacy and allow priests to marry. Did you know that? And so Catholics are up in arms around the world, and they're wanting to get rid of this Pope, not because of his leftist, socialist, communist leanings, but because he wants to do away with celibacy. The world has gone mad. Or is it only Barnabas or I who have no right to refrain from working? Now there's another point. Whoever goes to war at his own expense. Who plants a vineyard does not eat of its fruit, or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? Do I say these things as a mere man, or does not the law say the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are not we even more? Nevertheless, we've not used this right, but endure all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? Even so the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. But I've used none of these things, nor have I written these things, that it should be so done to me, for it would be better for me to die than anyone should make my boasting void. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward, but if against my will, I've been entrusted with a stewardship. What is my reward then, that when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel? For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who were under the law as under the law, that I might win those who were under the law. To those who were without law as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who were without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I've become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. Everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our example, to the intent we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has taken you, except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, though many, are one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. Observe Israel after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to idols is anything? Rather, that the thing which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions, for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord and all its fullness. If any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner, and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no question, for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord and its fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? If I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews, to the Greeks, or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. You know, when I said about the hermeneutical point a moment ago, one thing we need to remember and be reminded of regularly is that when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, he didn't write chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. Those chapter divisions came later. And they're here simply for us to access the same portion of Scripture and read them together like we're doing now in a Bible class. It's for our convenience. It's not inspired. But it is interesting, oftentimes, and this is one of those cases where you see chapter divisions, if you put them together, actually work out. But sometimes we read chapter 8 and say, there's a unit. We read chapter 9 and say, there's a unit. Chapter 10 says, there's a unit. I submit to you, it's one thought. Two subpoints to it. The question has to do with whether or not Christians should eat food offered to idols. Now, you could look at what John wrote, the churches of Asia, for example. I mean, on more than one occasion. And you could read what the apostles said in Acts chapter 15 and the elders there. What did they say about eating food offered to idols? This is the overall context, by the way. So what was the rule about eating food offered to idols? What about drinking blood? What about committing fornication? Do you have an answer for those? Should you commit fornication? No. Should you drink blood? No. Should you eat food offered to idols? No. It's all in the same thing, by the way. It's the same breath. And so, when you read chapter 8, you kind of get the impression that Paul's saying, if nobody saw you, if no one was the wiser, well then you could, go to the idol's temple and you could eat at their feast, and that'd be okay. Because there's two things that he's trying to do here. What are those two things? You tell me before I tell you. What two things is he trying to say here? Okay. I shouldn't participate in idolatry, right? That's one thing, yes. What's the other thing?
You shouldn't violate someone else's conscience with your actions.
it's kind of an overarching, more general principle. But in this case, he's using idolatry. He nails it in chapter 10, by the way. Let him that thinks he stands. That's what it's driving to. That's the driving thought beginning in chapter 8. We would say, and I'm saying this respectfully, we would say there were some smart alecks who thought, we can go to the idol temple on Saturday night, and if you knew anything that went on at those places, it'd be like going to a club. People go, quote, clubbing today. Well, what typically happens when you go clubbing, besides doing drugs and dancing? And, okay, you understand where I'm going with this. So that's what happens. But it was worse than that. We're talking orgies in the name of religion. That's what they were doing. And so there were apparently some people in the church at Corinth that said, I can go there because I don't believe in these idols anyway. They're not real. They're just pretended things. And so I'm just going to go hang out with my friends. Been a long day, long week. It's Friday night. I'll go to the temple. We'll hang out over there, and I'll eat some good food and maybe drink a little wine and just have a good time with my friends. What's the big deal? That seemed to be the reasoning on the part of some. I'm just reading between the lines, seeing where they're coming from. So to address that, first and foremost, Paul says, number one, you need to think about what you're doing and how it impacts and influences other people. So it's almost as though he's saying, okay, fine. We all have knowledge. We know there's nothing to that. But you go and you do that, and you let someone see you do that, be it a fellow Christian or an unbeliever, a Jew, a Gentile, or the Church of God. It doesn't matter who it is. Someone sees you and they've got a weak conscience. Now, when he says weak conscience, what do you mean by that? An uninformed, unenlightened conscience. They're not properly trained in their thought process to understand that someone that takes a block of wood and carves an image in it and bows before it, that's just a block of wood. It's not really a God. They've been raised and they've been taught and programmed to believe that is a God. And so, but you know better. And so you can go eat this food offered to that idol God. It doesn't mean anything to you because it's just an idol God. But this guy sees you doing it, and he's thinking, well, he's a faithful, active member of the church. I guess it's okay then for Christians not just to partake of the Lord's Supper, but also to eat at the idol. So we can do both. And Paul is saying, you're going to send the wrong message in doing that. And so this long discussion in chapter 9 about the fact that he's an apostle, he has the right to charge them for his labors among them, to be compensated financially as a preacher. But Paul said, I'm not going to utilize that right. I have that right, but I'm not going to utilize it. And why is he not utilizing it? Well, he didn't want to be a burden to them. But he's also making a point here. I have the right to do it, but I ain't going to do it. Again, you get the impression he's almost acquiescing to those smart alecks who were saying, we can go to the temple, it doesn't matter to us. Almost as though he's granting them, sure you can, as though it's a matter of indifference. But then you get to chapter 10, and he makes it abundantly clear, you can't do that. I don't care what you know or what you don't know. First of all, he said in chapter 8, you don't know anything yet as you ought to know. You may think you know it, but you don't fully know it. You're not fully aware as you should be. So that's number one. Number two, whenever a Christian starts thinking, I can go here and I can participate in these things and it won't affect me, take heed lest you fall. That's what he's saying. And we read that passage and we just say, well, that's where the Calvinists are wrong. Well, it's true, but he's not really talking about Calvinism here. It does apply there, but that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a Christian that thinks so highly of their own spiritual stamina and strength that I can go into the belly of the lion den really and it won't affect me. I won't get bit. I won't get eaten. I won't die in the process. And Paul's saying you will die. You have no business going there. But then he kind of shifts, and as though at the latter part of chapter 10, he does say something of a practical nature that's related to the question of eating food offered to idols, because this was the practice. In these idol temples, a lot of meat was cooked, and it was not always consumed. People get drunk, they start throwing up and doing their thing, getting high or whatever, and they don't have time to eat it all. There's a lot of leftover food. What are you going to do with all leftover food? Well, they would take that leftover food and they would carry it to the open marketplace, and they would sell it, and people would buy it and take it home and eat it. Well, now, I don't think they had all of their USDA labels on all their stuff. And it's like, this was offered to Beelzebub last Friday evening. It wasn't labeled that way. Maybe harmful to your spiritual health. There were no warning labels on it. So it was just meat hanging out in the open market. And now the person that hung it there, they might know where they got it, either from the local farm or from the local temple. They would know the difference, but you wouldn't necessarily know the difference where that meat came from. But if you walked to the marketplace and you said, hey, where'd you get that meat? And he said, well, it was offered to Beelzebub in the open, or Aphrodite, or whoever, last Saturday night at the temple. And that's where that meat came from. Paul's saying, don't buy that chunk of meat. Not because it's going to hurt you, because it is, in this instance, just a chunk of meat. That's all it is. But to the person who just told you where that meat came from, it's more significant than that. It's associated with idolatry. So if you buy it, take it home, he's going to think what? It's okay for a Christian to be involved with idolatry. Or if someone invites you to their house, even an unbeliever, and they put food before you, keep your mouth shut until you're opening to eat, and just eat it. Don't ask any questions. But if you ask what, hey, where'd you get this meat? You say, well, I got it from Aphrodite's worship service the other day. Don't eat it. Why? Because it's just a hunk of meat. Yes, but that person now knows that you know, and that you're eating it with the knowledge this meat was offered to an idol, so they're watching what you do. So it's kind of interesting how these two things are intermingled and overlapping. Some things are innocent in of themselves from a practical nature. But there's something that was going on at Corinth that was just completely unacceptable. The idea that a Christian could go to such a feast and think that's okay. Everywhere in the New Testament, that practice was condemned categorically. No question, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So Paul's not saying something different here either. He's simply having a discussion about how what we do has influence on other people. And even though you may, quote unquote, have the right to do something, if it's going to hurt somebody for you to exercise that right, don't exercise it. And we're just talking about food. Don't eat. Just don't eat it. It's not worth destroying a man's conscience and sending his soul off into perdition because you want something to eat. So that's what Paul is saying in this whole discussion. Any questions or comments that you may have?
Practically, if a Muslim was operating a grocery store and we went there and bought our food and ate it, and going to the Muslim temple and having fellowship with them in their worship, we can see that distinction clearly.
The same thing, yeah.
That's what he's saying here.
Yes, that's correct. It's the same principle. So the principle still applies. And it has application, I believe, in other ways. You probably, that's one good example, but there are other ways that I believe the principle here could be violated. Okay, any question about that? Good. We're finished with 1 Corinthians. We're going to move into 2 Corinthians. See how quickly that happened? I want you to notice on the map, I don't have a pointer. I thought about doing something I've never, ever in my entire life even thought about doing, that is tell a lie. Maybe tell several lies in a row. My nose would grow really long and I could use my nose to point. I don't have a pointer. So I'm going to have to see if you can just stay with me. If you look at the map, Mediterranean Sea, look over here, kind of in the middle of the map, you see Ephesus. Can y'all read that? Okay, there's Ephesus right there in the middle of the map on the Aegean Sea. Come straight across from Ephesus, and you got Athens, Corinth, Cenchrea. You see that? There's Corinth, Cenchrea, and Athens. This is kind of the Greek peninsula here. And you come north, and you have Philippi. Now notice on the far left, we got, it's kind of off to the side, but Philippi, that area there, is called Macedonia. And the southern portion down here, where Corinth is Achaia. Say that again. You got Macedonia and Achaia. Those are important names to remember. And you got Ephesus, because when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 8, he said, I will tarry at Ephesus until Pentecost. So we know for a fact Paul wrote 1 Corinthians while he's at Ephesus. You read about this in chapter 19 of the book of Acts. He had a good work while there at Ephesus. A lot of converts were made there, and a lot of controversy was stirred while he was there at Ephesus. Anytime there's great success going on, there's going to be great opposition going on. I do watch the news. I know that whenever there's someone being successful, there's going to be a lot of folks trying to oppose that success. So that was the case in the gospel effort itself. And so Paul has many adversaries at Ephesus. But he writes 1 Corinthians. Now, very quickly, we know that Paul had already written a letter to the Corinthian church, which we do not have a copy of. We know this because in chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians, he mentioned it. We don't have that letter. But he did mention it. So that's really 1 Corinthians. And 1 Corinthians is really at least 2 Corinthians. Does that make sense? As far as Paul's letter writing, I mean. Not what we have in this, but Paul's letter writing. So we've got at least 3 letters now that we know about. Okay. I have a view of 2 Corinthians that's not odd or different per se, but probably different than some in this class. And you may want to take issue with me, and that's okay. This is one of those instances where sometimes we can conjecture, we can surmise innocently. It wouldn't make any difference one way or the other what our view is. Because the teaching is not altered. It's just how do we fit it into a historical context. And so when we read 2 Corinthians, the question that I think most people would assume, and many do assume, when you read 2 Corinthians, what you're reading is the follow-up to 1 Corinthians. And so Paul is just, it's kind of like 1 and 2 Thessalonians. I have a little different view. I believe that there was another letter written between 1 and 2 Corinthians, which makes 2 Corinthians 4 Corinthians, if that makes sense. And I want to list my reasons why I think that. If you have a pen and paper, you might want to write these down. I want you to write these down. I want you to go home and read them and come back. And if you disagree with me in 2 weeks, we'll take it up then. But give me about 6 minutes, and that's all the time I got left. I'm going to run through this very quickly. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 to 2. Everything now is in 2 Corinthians, chapter 2, 1 to 2. Paul said, I determined this within myself, that I would not come again to you in sorrow. Now, when Paul came to establish the church at Corinth, there's nothing in chapter 18 of Acts that says he came there in sorrow. Now, he did have sorrow while there because there was opposition to him, but that was the case wherever he went. He didn't go anywhere. He didn't have that kind of sorrow. But when he came to Corinth, he didn't come in sorrow to that city to establish a church. But he does say here in chapter 2, verse 1, I'm not going to come again to you in sorrow. Just note that one. Again, chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, verse 14. Paul says, now for the 3rd time, I'm ready to come to you. And I will not be burdensome to you, for I do not seek yours but you, for the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parent for the children. For the 3rd time, I'm ready to come to you. How many times had he been there before he wrote 2 Corinthians? Twice. Read Acts 18. Once. Well, why did he say I'm thought. That's 2 Corinthians 12, 14, and 15. Chapter 13, verse 1. Paul said, this will be the third time I'm coming to you. There's no ambiguity here. So there was a second trip. Where that trip is recorded, you tell me. I don't see it in Acts. But it happened because he said it did. But the third time I'm coming to you, by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word shall be established. I've told you before, I foretell you as well present the second time. Now being absent, I write to those who have sinned before, and to all the rest, that if I come, I will not spare, since you seek a proof of Christ speaking to me, who is not weak toward you, but mighty in you. It is my view, I'm going to very quickly summarize here. Paul's in Ephesus, doing a great work there. The house of Chloe, representatives from Chloe's house came there. Paul has probably already been there. Gave him a bad report about things not going well at Corinth. So he fires off a second letter. He's already written one about immorality. So he fires off this second letter, which we call 1 Corinthians. Okay? Well, what happened at that point? We don't know, but based on what I just read to you, and I want you to go home and read this again later. Be the Ethiopian eunuch when we home tonight. Or when you get home, just read these texts for yourself. At some point, he went back there. It's my view that he left briefly the work at Ephesus. And he went across the sea to Corinth. And the reason he went there was because word had gotten back to him after 1 Corinthians, which is 2 Corinthians. After that second letter, which is 1 Corinthians, had been sent, word came back to him, there's something going on here. What was going on was there was a group of Jewish Christians, like everywhere else Paul went, that were rearing their heads, opposing Paul, questioning his gospel, questioning his authority as apostle, questioning his looks, questioning his speaking ability, insulting him on every possible level, trying to diminish his influence in the church. So Paul goes to Corinth to personally deal with this matter. When he got there, there was a ringleader of this group. There always is. It's not always easy to identify who's the ringleader, because sometimes the ringleader has a right-hand man, kind of like Baghdadi, we blew up his right-hand man too. Or blew themselves up. Anyway, we have ringleaders. So Paul goes there. Chapter 2, verse 5 of 2 Corinthians. Listen again, based on what I just told you, this is kind of where I'm coming from. He said, if anyone has caused grief, he's not grieved me, but all of you to some extent, not to be too severe. This punishment which was inflicted by the majority is sufficient for such a man. Typically, this chapter is assumed to reference chapter 5, 1 Corinthians, and the fornicating brother. That's very possible. And if you take that view, that's fine. It doesn't matter who the sinner is. The principle of forgiveness is the same. That's what matters. But I'm simply saying to you that I believe it makes sense, at least to me, that this is not the fornicating brother of 1 Corinthians 5, although what he's saying would apply to him too. If he were penitent, we don't know if he were or weren't. Maybe he was. I hope that he was. But be that as it may, I believe he's talking about someone else. He said in verse 7, so that on the contrary, you ought rather to forgive and comfort him. I believe him is the ringleader of opposition to Paul. Reaffirm your love to him. For to this end I also wrote, that I might put you to the test, whether you are obedient in all things. Now whom you forgive anything, also forgive. For if indeed I have forgiven anything, I have forgiven that one for your sakes in the presence of Christ, lest Satan should take advantage of us. For we're not ignorant of his devices. Chapter 10. I'm hurrying. Verse 7. Do you look at things according to the outward appearance? If anyone is convinced in himself that he is Christ, let him consider that is this in himself, that just as he is Christ, even so. Slow down. Shh. Those kids will be fine. Give me 3 minutes. Okay. Even so are we Christ. For even if I should boast somewhat more about our authority, which the Lord gave us for edification, not for your destruction, I shall not be ashamed, lest I seem to terrify you by letters. For his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech contemptible. Let such a person consider this, that what we are in word by letters, when we are absent, such will we also be in deed when we are present. There's some people that are truly opposed to Paul. And so I believe that Paul wrote another letter. He went and visited the church at Corinth. And he faced opposition, discovered a ringleader. He did not fully resolve the situation, had to go back to finish his work at Ephesus. But after getting to Ephesus, wrote another letter which we don't have recorded in our New Testament. He wrote 3 Corinthians. And he sent it by the hand of Titus. Chapter 7, verse 12. Listen, therefore I wrote to you, I did not do it for the sake of him who had done the wrong, nor for the sake of him who suffered wrong, but that our care for you in the sight of God might appear to you. So he's talking about writing them a letter about someone that did the wrong. What wrong? What person is he talking about? He talked about a lot of things in 1 Corinthians. But he's here speaking about and contemplating writing a letter dealing with that one who did the wrong. Chapter 2, verse 3. I wrote this very thing to you, lest when I came I should have sorrow over those for whom I ought to have joy, having confidence in you and all the joy that you have of you all, rather proud of much affliction and anguish of heart. I wrote to you with many tears, not that you should be grieved, but that you might know the love which I have abundantly for you. You could take the view that he wrote the 1 Corinthians letter we have in tears. There wouldn't be any problem believing that. I don't think so, not the way he seemed to be wording it. I personally, my opinion, believe he's talking about another letter, a severe letter, which again he's going to reference in chapter 7, verse 5. We don't have time to read it because the deacons can't have any patience in this church. And they ring the bell always dutifully on the same time. I did get through after a minute. I said, no, I'm greedy. But we'll try to pick up on this next time. But read through this, chapter 7, verse 5 through 9. I want to read that as well when you get home. But I want to set all that up because I believe if you understand it the way I'm seeing it, it's very helpful and enlightening as far as how churches should deal with these kinds of issues. But any questions or comments? I guess you're out of town. Oh well. I tried. Thank you. My son spent the night wandering through my house, banging and knocking and kicking, and apparently he doesn't sleep. So I didn't sleep last night. Scared me to death this morning. I was in the kitchen making my sandwich about 4:10 this morning, and I hear a noise. I turn around and there's Arthur looking at me. He said, "What are you doing?" "What are you doing?" If I ramble tonight, it's because I am completely, utterly sleep deprived. I thought Regina would take care of that matter, and she did not. She slept through the whole thing, apparently. You have a song? Number 815. I think that's 815, isn't it? And that's what time I'm going to get up. You stop talking. 8:15 in your songbook. There's a ladies' day this Saturday hosted by Tallapoosa, also at Central Church in Smyrna. Tallapoosa will begin with registration at 8:30, Central at 9:30. Friendsgiving Fellowship this Saturday, November 2nd, at home of Brian and Tammy Mitchell, starting at 4 p.m. Excuse me, please bring meat, buns, drinks, dessert, and chips. And if you go to Walmart deli section, they've got this Oreo lasagna thing. It is out of this world good. I'm just saying, that's a suggestion. First Sunday scheduled this Sunday, don't forget, 10 a.m. First service for Bible study, 11 a.m. for worship, followed by fellowship meal, Sunday for the Savior, then our 1:30 afternoon service. baby shower for Tessa Cunningham. Who's that? Tessa Cunningham this Sunday at 4 p.m. at the home of Deanna Johnson. This will be a gift card diaper shower. Jonathan and Tessa are expecting a baby girl. If you need directions to the Johnson, please see Chris or Deanna or one of their daughters. Don't forget to set your clocks back 1 hour this Saturday evening. We fall back. And again, I mentioned this to the adult class. Everyone probably already knows, but our sister Nell is presently with her family. I believe is it Calhoun? Is that where the service is? Her brother unfortunately passed away. The namesake, or he was the one that her son was named after. Conyer. Was it Conyer? I thought it was Calhoun. Anyway, the family's having the memorial this evening. He was cremated, but he passed away 6:30 Sunday evening on the very day that she had buried her son. So a very sad, distressing time for our sister. We want to remember her in our prayers. Anyone else we need to mention? Brother, again, I mentioned this earlier, but Stan did get to go home, and apparently the shock treatment worked for him, and they were shocking his heart. Anyway, anyone else we need to mention on our prayer list? Number 815 in your psalm books. It is the middle of the week. It's raining, miserable outside, weather-wise. You've found it in your heart and in your schedule to be here tonight. Why would you go to the trouble to be here? Well, obviously, because you love the Lord, you love His people, you love the Bible, you love Bible study, and that's grand. That's good. It may be that you're here because you know you have great need spiritually, of a spiritual nature that need to be addressed. We all do. But if we sing this song that's been announced, this is a convenient time for those who've not yet obeyed the gospel to render obedience. For those who need to respond, be restored to their first love, asking for the prayer to the church, this